session of our video devotions. We've been walking through the book of Romans here over the last several weeks. Hope you've enjoyed that, found that to be informative and beneficial to your own spiritual development. Today we're going to dive into chapter 4 of Romans, and so I'd love to have you follow along there with us. I think it's important as we study the scriptures to know as much background as we can about the text and who it was to and what's it for and the original intent of the author. And Paul writes to the church at Rome here, even though he's never met the Christians at Rome. As he writes this, he writes because he's heard about their faith and he wants to encourage them. And so Paul writes to a group of Christians that are brand new Christians, and most of them come from a predominantly Jewish background. And because of that, some of the things that have happened with the Jewish Christians where they had developed a thought process that their salvation was linked to their good deeds or their observance of some form of law that God had given. And so Paul begins to write about this and address the issue that we're not saved by the good works we do, rather because of what Jesus has done for us. And so Paul addresses these things, and as he addresses them in the book of Romans, we see two myths that come out of that and are still relevant in our culture today. The first myth is that our good or bad behavior or our lifestyle determines our destiny. There would be some that would believe that we will spend eternity, or where we spend eternity is based primarily on how we act on earth, how we live our lives, whether we're generally good. And if you're generally good, you're going to end up in heaven. If you're below average in your behavior or your lifestyle, then you are going to spend eternity separate from God. But as we look at the scripture, Paul confronts that myth. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, Paul says this. He says, "What shall we say about Abraham, our forefather?" They would have understood who Abraham was. "What did he discover in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by his works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." So Abraham is regarded as a righteous man. The question is, why? Hebrews 11 talks about him being a great man of faith. Hebrews 11 talks about him being a man of righteousness. Well, why was he righteous? Was he righteous because he did everything right and good? No, we know he sinned. Was he declared righteous because he did more good than he did wrong? Well, no one can keep track of that kind of statistic. So the question is, why was he declared righteous? The Bible in verse 3 there, Romans 4, says that he believed in God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Not that he earned it, not that his good obedience and his good works earned that, but it was his faith in God. Paul writes to the church at Ephesus and he says something very similar. In chapter 2 of Ephesians, in verse 8, he says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, it is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." He says that our works don't save us. Our works are important, our obedience is important, but it doesn't save us. The sacrifice of Jesus is what saves us. And so our faith, Abraham's faith, our faith and submission to Jesus connects us to that salvation and that grace, the free gift that God has given us. Myth number 2 is this myth that because we're saved by grace and the free gift of God, we shouldn't worry about being obedient. We should just live however we want to. Kind of the polar opposite of the idea of works salvation. Some would say, well, since we're not saved by our good deeds, what does it matter how we live if all we have to do is believe in God? But we see there's a direct correlation between our belief and our good deeds. That even though our good deeds don't save us, we're still called to a lifestyle of submission and a lifestyle of obedience. But there's a different attitude there. The attitude is that our good deeds that we do aren't done out of obligation or out of fear, but our good deeds are done out of gratitude. It's not I have to serve God, but because he is so good to me, I want to serve God. There's a difference in that distinction there. So hopefully we can combat those myths that are floating around in our culture today. Let me leave you with 2 good questions for you to think about as you read Romans 4. One is, do you find yourself doing good things because you still believe that it's going to earn you good standing with God? Ask yourself that question. Second of all, does your lifestyle reflect an appreciation for what God has done for you through Christ? So as you read Romans 4, dissect those questions in your own life. Look forward to seeing you next week.